welcome to our deep dive. Today, we are tackling a concept that is, well, it's at the heart of almost every political argument we have, the idea of the citizen.
We're going beyond the simple definition.
Exactly. Not just who holds a passport, not just about paying taxes. We're asking what it truly means, philosophically, morally, to belong to a political community. What is the real nature of that relationship?
And that's the core mission. To answer it, we're synthesizing a really monumental piece of analysis. We're looking at an excerpt from Mortimer J. Adler's Syntopicon essay, which is titled, very simply, Citizen.
And for anyone who isn't familiar, Adler's work isn't really a simple dictionary definition. It's more like a map.
It's a map of a centuries-long argument. That's the perfect way to put it. This essay is one of his 102 introductions to the great ideas, and it's a navigational tool for the great books of the Western world.
So it's not giving you the answer.
Not at all. It stages the debate. It uses Plato, Aristotle, Locke, Rousseau, the entire canon, to show you the tensions in how this single concept has been understood over time. It basically forces you to weigh the evidence for yourself.
Now, before we get into that substance, we should mention something unique about how we're approaching this. You're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's NotebookLM for a deeper and more dynamic analysis of this essay.
And that system is what allows us to process this kind of dense structural material and really present it to you in a clear conversational way. A key insight it helps surface is just the structural placement of this essay.
Where it sits in the overall collection.
Right. Adler uses this essay to examine whether the good citizen is, say, a rights holder, a virtuous participant in government, or maybe just a subject who is bound by law. And its location in the Syntopicon is so telling. It appears early in Volume 1, right between Change and Constitution.
That placement alone says so much.
It really does. It signals that citizenship is the living human connection between the stability of a constitution and the constant messy reality of historical change. The citizen is the agent.
They're the one making the theory real.
That's it. Their status, their duties, their rights. That's the mechanism by which a constitution either thrives or just completely collapses under the pressure of real-world change.
So our goal for you today is to give you a kind of comprehensive shortcut into this huge debate. By the end of this, you'll grasp Adler's main argument that citizen is this contested ideal.
An ideal that combines three, often competing, demands: membership, active participation, and a deep moral responsibility.
And understanding that framework is the key to making sense of the tensions in our own political lives today. Okay, let's unpack this and start with the core concept itself.
Let's do it.
We tend to use the word citizen as just a legal label. You have the papers, you belong to the state, and that's the end of it. But Adler's essay pushes us way past that. What is his central thesis?
His thesis is that the meaning of citizenship is never fixed. It shifts, and it shifts profoundly with the underlying constitution of the state.
So it means one thing in a monarchy.
And something completely different in an aristocracy, and then wildly different again in a democracy.
Yeah.
But despite all that variation, it always has one constant element.
Which is?
It always defines the individual's relationship to the common good. It's the mechanism that connects the individual person, not just to the power structure, but to the entire collective and a shared purpose.
So if the common good is defined differently, say in Athens, it's the flourishing of the city, but in a modern liberal state, it's about individual freedom,
then the requirements of citizenship have to change. They must change. And this is where the classical definition becomes so important to Adler's whole analysis.
He goes back to the beginning.
He has to. He grounds the concept in Aristotle's Politics.
Yeah.
And the core idea there is that a citizen belongs to a political community not just as a subject under power, not just as someone who receives orders, but as a genuine participant in rule.
A participant. That's the key word.
It's everything. It means you share in both the benefits, like security and justice, and also the burdens, like taxes or military service.
That idea of participation feels like the biggest gap between the classical ideal and, well, the reality for most of us today.
It is. In the purest Aristotelian sense, a citizen is one who both rules and is ruled in turn under a constitution. This idea of reciprocal governance is vital.
What does that actually imply?
It implies two things. First, you have a shared stake. You have skin in the game because at some point you might be the one making the decisions. And second, it implies rotating authority. Power isn't permanently held by one person or one class. It circulates.
That's a deeply democratic idea, but it immediately raises the question of scale. Most people in the modern world don't spend their week holding public office or debating policy in an assembly.
Not at all. We're governed by professionals, by representatives, by huge bureaucracies.
So how does Adler square that Aristotelian ideal of ruling and being ruled with the massive reality of a modern state?
He does it by forcing us to see the multiple meanings that have attached themselves to the word citizen over centuries. He says we have to stop thinking of it as one single concept. He highlights three crucial distinctions.
Okay.
First, there's legal status. This is the simple, formal membership. Your passport, your right to travel, your protection from arbitrary arrest. This is the baseline.
That seems pretty straightforward, though even that has been fought over for centuries. Who even qualifies for that status?
Oh, absolutely. But as a concept, it's the simplest layer. The second layer is the political role. This is where that Aristotelian ideal lives.
This is the active part.
This is the doing. It involves the actual share and deliberation in holding office in voting, the tangible exercise of power. In a modern state, this is voting, sure, but it's also organizing, petitioning your government, participating locally. This is the engine of self-government.
And the third layer sounds like the most difficult one. It moves from outward actions to an inward state of mind.
It is. That's the ethical vocation. This is the highest meaning. And it transforms citizenship from just a status into a moral project.
What does that mean, a moral project?
It's the requirement to cultivate civic virtue, to have a genuine concern for the common good, even when it directly conflicts with your own private interests or your convenience. It suggests that just obeying the law isn't enough.
You have to care about whether the law is just.
Exactly. And you have to care about the flourishing of your fellow citizens.
Let's stay on that for a second. The ethical vocation. What does that actually look like in practice? It sounds like it demands a level of self-sacrifice that modern individualism doesn't have much time for.
It does demand sacrifice, but not necessarily in a dramatic way. It can look like informed critique of your own government, not just blind support. It means being willing to pay your taxes honestly.
Not just because you'll get caught if you don't.
Right, but because you actually understand that public safety, schools, infrastructure, all of it, depends on that collective contribution. In its highest form, it's being willing to do unpleasant public duties, like jury service, or even speaking out against corruption. It's having an active moral conscience about the state itself.
It's the difference between asking, what can I get away with, and asking, how can I help make this system better?
That's a perfect way to put it. And this leads right into another key distinction the essay makes, the difference between a citizen and a subject. This is critical for understanding political history.
So a subject is just someone who obeys.
A subject is defined by obedience. They are under the power of a ruler. Their relationship is one of passive compliance. They are acted upon.
Whereas a citizen is an actor.
A participant. They are, in some sense, co-authors of the law that they then obey.
Yeah.
They help define the political direction. In an absolute monarchy, almost everyone is a subject. In a true republic, the ideal is that every member is a citizen, invested with a little piece of that sovereignty.
And even within the category of citizen, Adler refines it even more, which feels very relevant to today.
He does. He distinguishes between the active citizen and the passive citizen.
The active citizen is the one who's actually doing the work.
They're exercising their power. They vote regularly. They show up to meetings. They engage in public debate. The passive citizen, on the other hand, holds the formal legal status and the protections that come with it, but they mostly just receive the state's effects without really exercising their political role.
And that feels like the great challenge for modern democracy, doesn't it? The risk that most of us, most of the time, are really just passive citizens.
It's the great democratic atrophy. The essay suggests that in a massive modern state, there's a constant gravitational pull toward passivity. The active citizen becomes a rare species.
Maybe just a small group of politicians and activists.
And policy experts, right? The bulk of the population, even with all their formal rights, behaves much more like subjects. They're very protective of their individual rights, which is the liberal model, but they're largely disconnected from the duties of participation, which is the Republican model.
And the scale of the community changes everything. I mean, being a citizen in a small Greek city-state must have felt completely different.
The scale's transformative. Adler spends a lot of time on the distinctions between a citizen of a city-state, an empire, and a modern nation-state. In the polis, because of the small scale, direct rule was actually possible.
The political role and the ethical vocation were almost the same thing.
They were nearly inseparable. Every citizen could, in theory, be in the assembly or serve on a jury. The political life was the good life.
But as soon as the community gets bigger, that kind of direct participation is impossible.
It becomes physically impossible, so the definition has to stretch. In a huge empire, like the Roman Empire, Citizenship started to emphasize the legal status and protection, civis Romanus, over that intense participation in ruling.
This created the powerful idea that rights could extend far beyond the capital city.
Exactly. For a Roman citizen living in, say, Gaul or Judea, their status wasn't defined by their vote in Rome. It was defined by their protection under Roman law and their exemption from the arbitrary rule of local leaders.
And in the modern state, the scale is just immense. Hundreds of millions of people.
And that scale requires representation and bureaucracy. It fundamentally changes what participation can even look like. We are forced to rely on indirect governance, which inherently challenges that old Aristotelian ideal of ruling and being ruled in turn.
Which is why the fight for transparency and accountability is so central to modern politics.
It's everything. How do you make this massive state apparatus actually accountable to a citizenry that is, by necessity, mostly passive?
What's so fascinating is how Adler's essay shows the idea of the citizen isn't a standalone concept, it's connected to everything else.
It's the engine room of political thought. The editors of the Syntopicon positioned it as the nodal point, the intersection of political forms and moral ideals. Adler explicitly links citizen with constitution, democracy, government, liberty, law, state, and revolution.
So if you pull on that one thread, who is a citizen, what do they owe, the whole sweater unravels.
The whole structure of the polity comes with it. If you want to understand justice, law, or government, you first have to understand who the persons are that those concepts apply to.
The definition of the citizen determines everything else.
It's the core variable in the whole political equation. For example, if you define citizen very narrowly, like the Greeks did, excluding women and slaves, then your concept of justice will also be narrow. It only fully applies within that privileged circle.
But if you define it broadly, as modern states try to,
then your concept of justice has to expand universally to protect everyone with that legal status. It changes everything.
Let's shift now into the historical sweep of this essay. It's like a time machine, showing how the status of a person has changed so dramatically. We have to start in the classical world, where citizenship was demanding, but also incredibly exclusive.
Right, the ancient foundations. For Plato and Aristotle, in the Greek polis, citizenship wasn't just a legal status. It was the defining feature of a good life. It was the arena where you achieved virtue. It meant direct, intense participation.
The political community was the highest form of community.
And participation was essential for eudaimonia, for the complete realization of what it meant to be human.
But that realization came with a huge moral asterisk, didn't it? Because it systematically shut out most of the population. Slaves, foreigners, women.
It was intensive but intensely exclusive. And Adler highlights this paradox. The ideal was profound political engagement and shared power, but the reality was a small, privileged, male-only club. That fact is what anchors all the later debates about equality.
So the classical world gives us the ideal of participation.
But it fails completely on the ideal of universality.
Then the Romans come along and scale up the concept. It's a necessary step toward the modern state, even if it loses some of that Greek intensity.
Roman thought complicates that intense Greek model. It shifts the emphasis from active rule to legal protection. The powerful image of civis Romanus, the Roman citizen, meant that even if you didn't have a strong political role in Rome itself, you had this huge legal advantage that followed you everywhere.
That's a fundamental shift. The Greek citizen was defined by his duty to rule. The Roman citizen was defined by his right to protection.
A right to protection under a vast system of law. And that emphasis on law and legal rights, extended across a huge geographical area, became a foundational idea for the concept of universal rights that comes 2,000 years later.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. The next big disruption wasn't political, it was theological. The rise of Christianity completely changes the game.
It's a profound hinge point, and Adler uses it to set up what he calls the paradox of loyalty. Medieval Christian political theology introduced a higher loyalty that just fundamentally complicated earthly citizenship. Thinkers like Augustine in his City of God.
Right. There's now a loyalty that stands above and often in judgment of your loyalty to the king.
Exactly. The state is no longer the highest good. The individual person was now seen as having this inherent spiritual worth, a soul destined for an eternal kingdom. This creates a layered identity.
You're a person. You're a subject of a ruler.
And you're also a pilgrim, a citizen of a transcendent kingdom. This completely undercut the totalizing claims of the ancient state.
So if your highest loyalty is to God or to some universal moral truth, then the demands of the state suddenly become relative. They're not absolute anymore.
And that provided the moral leverage needed to challenge the state. This higher loyalty became a crucial check on earthly power. If the ruler's law contradicted divine law, the Christian citizen had a clear justification for moral resistance.
It sets boundaries on political obligation.
It's the intellectual bridge that leads directly to later ideas of limited government, individual conscience, and ultimately the natural rights philosophy of the Enlightenment. The citizen is not just a piece of clay for the state to mold. They're an agent of a higher moral order.
And that leads us to the early modern period, to the Enlightenment and social contract theory, where the whole concept of the state gets turned on its head.
The transformation is radical. With the rise of the nation-state, thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau recast the entire relationship. The source of authority shifts from God to the individual.
The state is no longer a divine creation. It's a human one, a tool.
A deliberate creation. The citizen becomes the bearer of natural rights that exist before the state, like life, liberty, and property. These citizens are the ones who authorize the government through a contract.
They agree to give up a little freedom for a lot of security.
Exactly. But crucially, they retain a residual sovereignty.
Yeah.
They are loaning their power to the government. They aren't surrendering their inherent rights.
So they move from being subjects who just obey to being the very source of the government's power. This is where citizen starts to carry the weight of revolution.
It is. Adler's essay shows how documents like the American Declaration of Independence recast citizens as both the creators and the judges of the political order. If the government becomes destructive of those rights, the citizens, as the source of sovereignty, have the authority to alter or abolish it.
It's a profound shift from the subject who receives the law to the citizen who creates it.
A total inversion of the power dynamic.
And bringing this narrative up to the modern era, we see this massive expansion of legal citizenship, but the fight for genuine inclusion and meaningful participation just intensifies.
It does. The reality was that even in the early republics, citizen meant a privileged male property owner. The modern story is the story of the expansion of that legal status. Broader suffrage, the inclusion of women, the end of formal racial exclusion, and the development of social rights.
The right to education, welfare, social security.
Right. The idea being that for citizenship to be meaningful, you need more than just the right to vote. You need the actual capacity to participate in a meaningful way.
And that's the core modern challenge.
It is. Industrialization, mass politics, struggles over race, gender, and class, they all force new questions. Is legal enfranchisement enough? Does the passive citizen in a massive modern state really exercise the kind of co-rule that Aristotle imagined? Or are they just better protected subjects? Adler's framework lets you track that constant tension between the legal ideal and the social reality.
Which sets us up perfectly for the core philosophical debates in the essay. These are the unresolved tensions that really define our political conflicts today, often pitting one ideal of the citizen against another.
And the synthesis reveals three major competing models. Understanding these is really the key to mapping almost any political debate you see today.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, you have the Republican citizen. This model is rooted in the classical world. Think of the early American Republic, when it was heavily influenced by Roman ideals. This citizen is defined by civic virtue, by intense participation, and by a willingness to sacrifice their private interest for the common good.
This is the ask not what your country can do for you citizen.
Precisely. Their identity is completely bound up in the life of the Republic. Duty comes first. Now, the counterpoint to that intense model is the one that really defines the modern age, the liberal citizen.
This sounds more familiar.
This model comes from Locke and the Enlightenment, and it dominates modern Western democracies. This citizen is defined primarily by individual rights, by legal protections against the state, and by freedom from interference.
So this citizen is asking, what rights must the state protect for me? The focus is on protection, not participation.
Correct. The main goal is to maximize your autonomy and your private life, your business, your family, your personal projects. Participation is mostly a tool to protect those rights, not a virtue in itself. Liberty comes first.
And the third model sounds less like an ideal and more like a reality check.
It is. It's the subject citizen. This model recognizes the huge gap that often exists between our constitutional ideals and the lived reality. This person is formally a citizen, they have a passport, they can vote, but in practice they function much more like a subject.
This happens when participation is just too difficult or feels meaningless.
Exactly. When it's manipulated or restricted or just too distant and complicated, their primary engagement is paying taxes and maybe voting once every few years. They become a passive recipient of government actions, not a co-author of the law.
And that clash between the Republican ideal of sacrifice and the liberal ideal of rights brings up one of the most classic tensions Adler identifies, the paradox of loyalty.
This is a profound ethical challenge. It's where political philosophy really heats your conscience. Adler highlights that moment when a government demands loyalty or obedience that conflicts with your personal morality or a higher ideal of justice.
What's the classic example of this?
The foundational example is Socrates. He is forced to choose between breaking the law by fleeing prison or submitting to an unjust death sentence prescribed by the law. He chooses to obey, which is the ultimate Republican ideal. You uphold the laws, even when they're flawed.
And the counterexample?
Antigone. She openly defies the law of the city to fulfill what she sees as a higher moral and religious duty to bury her brother.
So the question is, can a good citizen, someone who follows every law of a particular regime, sometimes be a morally bad person through their complicity?
And conversely, could a morally good person, someone upholding universal human rights, be forced to be a bad citizen by resisting an unjust law, by engaging in civil disobedience? Adler forces you to see that your allegiance to a particular government is often conditional on that government's allegiance to justice itself.
The ethical vocation can sometimes trump the legal status.
It has to. This is what keeps political life in a permanent state of tension, and it's why understanding this complexity is so important.
This level of synthesis, boiling down centuries of thought into these clear, usable models, is really the mission here. For more deep essay analysis, summaries, and critiques that inspire this kind of reflection, you can check out Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel.
Now let's look at another one of these enduring debates the essay brings up, the fight over equality versus hierarchy.
The question of who gets to be in the club.
Precisely. If citizenship is the status that gives you the right to co-rule, who gets to have it, and on what terms? Historically, the answer has almost always involved exclusion.
People have always justified these exclusions by claiming some groups just aren't competent to rule.
Exactly. The essay tracks these constant disputes over whether citizenship should be limited by property, or by gender, or race, or even your level of education. And these weren't just administrative rules, they were fundamental arguments about human capability.
The classical world, for instance, often said, yes, you need wealth and education to rule.
Aristotle himself excluded manual laborers, believing their work left them no time or mental energy for rational deliberation. And this history just reveals the immense distance between our soaring proclamations of equality, all men are created equal, and the reality of restricted franchises that existed for centuries.
So the tension is always there. The law says everyone is equal, but the actual rules for participation are based on property or race or sex.
And the promise of citizenship is betrayed. The political maturation of the West is really the story of trying to overcome these hierarchies.
The move from a few nominal equals in the polis to the modern ideal of universal suffrage.
It is, but the essay forces us to ask if our institutions have truly delivered on that promise. Even with universal suffrage, if economic conditions systematically prevent certain groups from effective participation, if they remain subject citizens, then the democratic promise is still incomplete. The fight over voter access today is just the latest chapter in that very old struggle.
Okay, let's turn to contemporary relevance. How do we take this historical framework and use it to understand what's happening right now?
It fundamentally changes how you process political information. It shifts your focus from just collecting data to achieving a real structural understanding.
What's the difference?
The information is just the facts, the different legal arrangements, the latest policy debates. The understanding is seeing how each of those historical models, Republican, liberal, Roman, is still at play, and how each one either supports or undermines human dignity and genuine self-government. It helps you see the real stakes.
So you start to recognize that today's arguments aren't really new. They're just old patterns in new clothes.
Absolutely. Adler's conceptual map makes it so much easier to interpret modern issues. When we debate immigration or dual citizenship or voter disenfranchisement or the quality of civic education, we realize we're just having new episodes of that same old argument about who belongs, what they owe, and on what terms.
Let's use immigration as an example. How does the framework apply?
It starts at the first level, legal status. The debate over who gets to cross the border and gain legal status is the most basic gatekeeping function of a modern state. But as soon as that status is granted, The debate immediately shifts to the other levels.
The political role and the ethical vocation.
Right. Does the new citizen have the capacity and the desire to participate? Does the state provide the support, education, language training that's necessary for them to become an active co-ruler instead of just a passive recipient of legal protection? The three meanings are always interacting.
And this framework now extends beyond physical borders into the digital world, which is a huge part of political life.
It does. Thinkers in the great books couldn't have imagined the internet, but the core relationship between the citizen and the state now plays out in these virtual spaces. When we debate the rules of a social media platform, we're really debating the terms of a new kind of public square. Who gets to speak? Who gets protected?
The fundamental questions don't change just because the forum is digital instead of stone.
They just manifest in new ways. We still have to ask, does the digital realm help create active citizens through education and organization? Or does it just produce more passive subject citizens trapped in information bubbles and low-effort consumption?
This brings us to a really practical warning that Adler's work seems to imply for modern democracies, which tend to celebrate the freedom of the liberal citizen, but forget about the activity of the Republican one.
The warning is clear, and it's profound. A polity that reduces citizenship to just passive consumption of benefits and sporadic voting risks sliding backward. It risks becoming a society of well-protected subjects rather than active co-rulers.
A kind of soft tyranny.
That's a good way to put it. When political responsibility is completely outsourced to professionals, the ethical vocation of the average citizen just atrophies. The democratic muscle weakens from lack of use.
So how do we fight that drift toward passivity? What's the solution the essay points to?
The solution is to realize all three meanings of citizenship at the same time. It means the state has to provide not just the abstract right to participate, but the actual conditions for effective participation.
That means things like good civic education.
Informed participation, right? But it also means equal legal protection for everyone and, crucially, adequate social support. The material conditions needed for citizens to actually use their freedom.
Because it's not enough to tell someone they're free to participate if they don't have the capacity to do so.
Exactly. If a person is working 3 jobs just to survive, facing constant insecurity, the time and energy and mental bandwidth required to be an informed, effective co-ruler, to be an active citizen, is just not there. The struggle for social justice is, at its core, the struggle to create the conditions for true political citizenship for everyone.
Which brings us back to the educational value of all this. Engaging with this kind of analysis is what a liberal education is supposed to do.
It's the highest aim. Grappling with Adler's essay helps you see the difference between loyalty to a specific, temporary regime and loyalty to justice itself. It sharpens the distinction between legal membership, which can be given or taken away, and a deeper moral solidarity with all people, which is a universal commitment.
It gives you a standard to measure your own political reality against.
It does. It provides a yardstick to measure our institutions against the idea that every person is worthy of participation and protection, not as a tool for the state, but as a co-author of our common life. Adler would argue this process trains you to question inherited narratives about patriotism and loyalty, and to see that politics is everyone's business.
So here's the final provocative thought, building on that tension between equality and governance. The essay shows real, undeniable progress in the widening of legal and political citizenship. The franchise is broader, the protections are more extensive, the legal barriers of race and gender have mostly been dismantled.
Yes, on that legal status level, there has been measurable progress. But the challenge remains, and the essay leaves this open. Have our modern institutions truly caught up with that ideal of genuinely equal co-rule?
We have the forms of democracy.
But do we have the substance of co-rulership for all? Or do the complexities of the modern world inevitably push most of us toward becoming those protected but passive subject citizens?
And that is the open question. It's the persistent struggle, and it's the ultimate challenge left to you, the modern citizen, to think about and to act upon.
The essay Citizen is this incredible focal point where all these disagreements about human nature, virtue, and law all converge. It really forces you to decide what your commitment to your community actually means.
Adler's synthesis is a roadmap. He doesn't give you the answer. He lays out the structure of the controversy itself, letting you weigh the Republican model, the liberal model, and the reality of the subject citizen against your own conscience.
An informed civic participation has to start with clarity about the terms of the debate. Understanding this essay is a powerful step toward that essential clarity.
Click the link on screen for more on this and other essay subjects. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.